But this next session is on South Asian regionalism, opportunities and challenges. It's a session that will focus on the future of the South Asian region and the promise of regional integration rather than fragmentation. Of course, we've been hearing from a lot of previous panels earlier today about the fragmentary side, but let's see if the regional unifying aspect of it can come through. So I'd like to invite the following persons onto the stage. Our chair for the session, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. He's the Ambassador at Large and Policy Advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. If you can come on the stage, Bilahari. Now, he's got a very long and distinguished career with the Foreign Service in Singapore. He joined it in 1981, and he's held various appointments in the MFA in Singapore before being named Singapore's ambassador to the Russian Federation in 1994. He was appointed as permanent representative to the United Nations in New York in 1995 and appointed deputy secretary in the MFA in 1998 and second permanent secretary in 2001. And he has been permanent secretary of Foreign Affairs since 2010. So a very long and distinguished career for our chair here. And I'd also like to invite Mr. Shyam Saran. He's the Foreign Secretary, former Foreign Secretary of India and Chairman of the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries. A round of applause, please. Mr. Claude Smadja, he's the President of Smadja and Associate Strategic Advisory from Switzerland. Professor S D Muni, he's a visiting research professor from the Institute of South Asian Studies. And Dr. Arjumand Hashmi, the mayor of Paris, Texas, USA, who I am assured has a very interesting story. So I will now hand it over to Bilahari Kausikan to chair this session. And of course, it'll be followed by questions and answers afterwards.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's not very nice to do it, but I have to start with a confession. When the chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, asked me to moderate this panel on regionalism in South Asia, it did cross my mind that he did so because he knew that my almost complete ignorance of the subject would make me a very neutral chair. I had, of course, heard of SADC and BIMSTEC and some other organizations as South Asian regional initiatives, but I confess that I had never paid much attention to them. And I don't think that my experience is unique among those in this region whose careers have been mainly concerned with the affairs of East and Southeast Asia. To us, thinking of South Asia and regionalism in a single sentence is not something that comes naturally. For example, ASEAN and SADC have had several meetings at different levels, but they have been very largely ritualistic affairs and nothing very concrete has come out of them. It's much more natural for us when we think of South Asia to think of specific countries, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, what have you. Think of it as individual countries and structure our relationships on that basis. And yet, when I came to think of it, SADC has been in existence for about a quarter of a century. Of course, not all that history has been very happy, but it's still quite a long history. About 20 years ago, I recall a senior Indian diplomat telling me that India's strategic interests were best served by ensuring that its neighbors were weak. I was a bit surprised, to tell you the truth. And I didn't know then, and I don't know now, if he was accurately reflecting mainstream Indian strategic thought of that period. But I am quite sure, I am 100% certain, that this no longer reflects India's current attitudes. Perhaps because once India actually found itself surrounded by weak countries, the experience was not as pleasant as it may have anticipated. India has always had a global vision of its international role, but it now, perhaps far more firmly than ever before, rests that global vision on the foundation of a stable, cooperative, open and mutually prospering region. It no longer seeks its security primarily through a somewhat chaotic effort, always beyond its powers, to exclude other major powers from the affairs of South Asia. It now tries to engage them in a constructive pattern of regional relationships. And now, among others, the US, China, Japan, and the ROK are observers in SADC. In any case, the South Asia and SADC of today are clearly on a very different trajectory. South Asia is not without its own challenges and complications. Which region is without its own challenges and complications? I can't think of any. Regionalism in South Asia will always proceed as regionalism in any region always proceeds. That is to say, by lurches and meanderings in response to unpredictable internal and external events. In any case, I very much look forward, as I'm sure all of you do, to being educated by this eminently qualified panel of experts. Ambassador Saran needs no introduction, I'm sure, nor does Mr. Smadja. What very, very little I know about South Asian regionalism, I've learned from Professor Mani's extensive writings on the subject. And if I may be so bold to say so, Dr. Hashmi's own career illustrates the growing political prominence of US citizens of South Asian origin, and perhaps also how the affairs of any region cannot, in this post-Cold War globalizing world, be entirely segregated from other regions. And that brings me to my final point before I shut up, and I will shut up, and let those you have really come here to hear speak. I hope at least some members of this distinguished panel will spend a little time reflecting on what regionalism means in an era where patterns of international trade, international finance, international production chains, as well as traditional and non-traditional security challenges are blurring, if not entirely erasing, conventional, geographically defined boundaries. One word on administrative matters. Each member of the panel has 7 to 10 minutes for their presentations, initial presentations, so as to allow maximum time for the audience to ask questions. I trust everybody will stick to the time limits. I will remind each speaker when the 7-minute mark has been reached. I intend to proceed in this order. First, Ambassador Saran, then Mr. Smadja, then Professor Muni, and Dr. Hashmi can have the last word. Well, without further ado, Ambassador.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think post-lunch regionalism is a little more difficult to deal with rather than pre-lunch regionalism, but I will still try my best. You spoke about what an Indian diplomat told you some years ago. I don't think he was much of a diplomat.
He wasn't you anyway.
But I think it would be important to perhaps bring to your attention that there has been a certain evolution in India's thinking about regional integration over the last several years. When SADC was actually first formed, as you said, Mr. Chairman, more than a quarter of a century ago, the general sense in India was that this was something like our smaller neighbors ganging up together against very large, important country like India. And therefore, there was almost like a sense of siege. There was a sense of hostility towards SADC. Although, I think in formal terms, India not only welcomed SADC, but also worked through SADC on initiatives such as the South Asia Preferential Trade Agreement and several other issues which were on the agenda. I think the change came about in the early 1990s when India itself started opening up to the dynamic regional economies of Southeast Asia, started opening out to the rest of the world. It became a country which saw its own economic future very much as part and parcel of the dynamic change that was taking place around us, all around us. The first aspect of this opening out was, of course, let us forget about these pesky neighbors and go straight to Southeast Asia, East Asia, and establish very strong bonds with them. We don't really have to worry so much about our immediate neighbors. Soon it became very clear that if India had any hope of making a success of its regional role or its later global role, if it did not take care of its own periphery, if it was not able to bring about a degree of integration in South Asia itself, its ambitions as a regional power, its ambitions as a global economic engine would not be realized. And I think that brought about a very major change. From being a laggard in terms of regional integration process, India actually became a champion. You will recall that in 2003, the then Prime Minister of India, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, set out a vision where he said, you know, why can't we have a customs union? Why can't we have a common currency? Why can't we have a South Asia parliament? Why can't we see a region where political divisions exist, but there is a free flow of goods, of peoples, of ideas across these borders? So at least a vision of how we look at South Asia, that vision was put forward. And as I said, India became a champion of integration rather than a laggard in the integration. But of course, India cannot do this alone. It has to work together with its neighbors. I think what India chose to do was to say, there is nothing that we can do about political divisions which divide the subcontinent. But what we can do is, can we, the very size of India, which created apprehensions and nervousness amongst its neighbors, could we use our size, in fact, as an asset? Could an open economy that India has today, can we become the source of growth, the source of economic and social development in our neighborhood? Because we are such a large country, we could do that. I mean, today we have, for example, duty-free access for several of our neighbors. The assumption being that if India is able to become a major factor in the development of its own neighborhood, this could in fact help in terms of dealing with the political divisions which have plagued the region for so long. This is a work in progress, and we will have to see how far we can take it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
7 minutes. We have 3 more, actually. Dr. Smadja.
Thank you.
You can either speak from the chair or go to the podium if you wish.
The title of the session is about opportunities and challenges. I would like to take a step backward. And I would like to speak about necessities before talking about opportunities and challenges. Regional integration today, in today's world, is a do or die necessity. In fact, one of the major trends triggered by globalization is regionalization, is in regional integration. In that respect, South Asia has been performing miserably. And by performing miserably, it has consigned itself to underdevelopment, to the suffering of populations which have not been able to see their standard of living increase in the way they would have been entitled to see the standard of living increase. Why is it a necessity? Look at the global trade scene today. The Uruguay round has been the last global trade round that, at least as far as I'm concerned, I will see in my lifetime. There will not be any single new global trade round. What you will see, which is reshaping the global trade landscape, are regional and intra-regional, inter-regional trade agreements. Whether it is the way NAFTA is evolving, whether it is the Pacific Alliance, whether it is now what the US and Europe are trying to do by the free trade and investment agreement that they have started to negotiate, or whether it is what we see in terms of regional trade integration in the ASEAN and ASEAN Plus area. In that respect, because South Asia has been lagging behind so badly, in a way, this reflects into the fact that with 25% of the population of the world, this region accounts for 40% of the poor of the world. This explains why this part of the world has 25% of the world population. It represents only 3% of the global GDP. So this is a necessity. And I think any thinking about pushing South Asia regional integration has to start by the acute awareness of this do or die necessity. Now, since yesterday, we have heard in this hall that it is all about politics. And we have heard that, of course, business people would like to do more business among themselves, that there are a lot of opportunities, but it is all about the politicians not opening the door to the opportunities that more cooperation, more integration would provide. I think it is a little bit of a caricature because we know that a lot of business has a vested interest in preventing further integration because this would mean that they would go outside of their comfort zone. Remember how the Indian business class was scared to death by the prospect of opening in the early 90s. And it is only when they were forced to plunge into cold water that they realized that this could be, in fact, very good for their health. And then many of them who were the most strongest opponent of liberalization became the strongest advocate. So I think we need today to look at this situation of integration, number one, from the perspective of do or die. Number two, by the perspective of the business community, but also civil society, the different actors in the societies of these different countries, now creating this kind of critical mass that will push forward, accelerating this process. Everybody knows about the opportunities. The question is not to discover opportunities. The question is, how do you create the practical steps that will create the momentum that this region needs for its integration?
Thank you. Professor Muni?
Thank you. Thank you. To begin with, I must thank my own institute and the chairman for getting me this opportunity. I am really very happy that this is far more impressive and effective convention from the one we had earlier. And to get on the podium for this convention is a real opportunity to interact with all sorts of people. Firstly, it is, I think, not correct to compare South Asian regionalism with either European example or the ASEAN example. There is a tendency always to compare it. If at all it has to be compared, it should be compared with the other Asian organizations like SCO or ECO or Gulf Cooperation Council or whatever else it is. Having said that, I may say something which may not be quite popular in Singapore, to say that South Asia is not governed by economic determinism. It is governed by the primacy of politics. This is what I wrote in my first book before the SARC was born, and I am sorry I can't change my opinion even today. Therefore, if there are many opportunities which have already been identified by a host of economic studies, and even various political leaders have given their statements. But somehow we find that though we have moved forward, but not fast enough, and not to the kind of goals which we set before us. And this is largely because of the political obstacles. And therefore, if we really want to fix the regional organization or regional cooperation, I think we need to fix the politics of the region. And if we don't fix the politics of the region, many of the economic issues, many of the cooperation issues, developmental issues would get somehow staggered in between. Now, how do you fix the politics of the region? My feeling is that it should be done at two levels, both at interstate and intra-state. In interstate, as Ambassador Saran said very rightly, that when SARC was born, there were all kinds of political hang-ups. In fact, the two major countries of the region, India and Pakistan, were least enthusiastic about this kind of a cooperative exercise. And at one stage, I remember one of the former foreign secretaries, Mr. Raskotra, telling me that India even offered that if you really want to go ahead without India, please go ahead. We will, from outside, support this regional exercise for whatever worth it is. From that position, I think both India has moved a long distance. And as again Ambassador Saran said just now, that 2003 there was a change. And I remember one of the speeches being made by him in India International Center, I think 2004 or 2005, when he said that the neighbors should look at India as an opportunity rather than as a liability or an adversity. And it is from this that India has moved forward in dealing with the neighbors, trying to understand their sensitivities. But there is no doubt that India has not moved enough. And there is still a lot of scope for India to do much more on that. On the other hand, I find that even the neighbors have somehow not been able to figure out how to adjust with this giant elephant-like neighbor, whether to integrate or not to integrate, whether to go closer or not to go closer. And these are the questions which are even today reflected in their reservations. India, for instance, also is, hesitant in granting transit rights to some of the countries. I mean, even if politically it is agreed, to translate political will and promise into decisions takes a huge long time, and I call it the delivery deficit in India's foreign policy, which irritates the neighbors. The neighbors, on the other hand, whether in trade matters, I don't want to mention, but Pakistan's MFN issue, or even in South Asian University, its board composition, there is a lot of hesitation in forwarding names here and there. Now, within intra-state, therefore, until these issues are sorted out, and even in intra-state relations, I think some of the neighbors have always tried to balance India in one way or the other. Now, there is a very interesting proposal, I will discuss if there are questions, that China be made a member of SADC. I think there is no avoiding or no denying the fact that South Asia will have to increasingly engage economically and otherwise with China. But making China a member of the SADC is almost no-no when it comes to that. Intra-state, I think most of the South Asian states are internally yet settled and stable. There are all kinds of problems. Democracy is not stabilized. I think it has to be consolidated. Look at the situation in Pakistan, in Maldives and Nepal, for instance. There are sharpening social cleavages and polarization where sometimes India gets dragged in even if it doesn't want to. And there is an erosion of governance all over the region. And unless these issues are fixed in internal politics, I don't think much attention would be drawn towards regional cooperation. And this is where I think a suggestion was made in the previous session that diaspora can play a role. I think you play a role as a lobbyist group in telling the South Asian countries both to sort out their bilateral issues as also to sort out internally, without any interference from anybody, their internal political issues. And unless these two things happen, I don't think regional cooperation's real obstacles would be removed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mani. Please, Dr. Hashmi.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here in Singapore today and have the opportunity to speak to you. I'd like to begin by thanking the National University of Singapore and ISIS for having me here today. The research that ISIS does helps us better understand contemporary South Asia, its challenges and its opportunities. It's a profound amount of work this organization does, not just for South Asian continent, but for all of us around the globe. South Asia and its progress are very dear to me since I started my journey in this part of the world. With success as a cardiologist in the United States, I felt the sense of responsibility that guided me to address the issues I saw in my community. Transitioning from the cardiac cath lab to the office of the mayor, I was guided by the political and economic environment of the society that I live in. As we look towards South Asia as a region, we find the region encompasses the most ancient as well as the most modern historic processes. The Indus civilization of Mohenjo-daro ranks in antiquity with other riverine civilizations of Nile and Euphrates, and there's a great deal of archaeological and historical evidence to suggest the contacts and connections between ancient Chinese civilizations and those of South Asia. A leap through time into the mid-20th century brings us to a global phenomena that changes the political order hitherto based upon 3 centuries of colonialism and economic domination into one of freedom and nationalism. The independence of South Asian states of Pakistan and India in August of 47 was the start of a political order of the earth. They were followed by other countries in neighborhood, then by others in the subcontinent, and immediately after by nations in Africa. At the end of World War II, when the United Nations was formed, it had a membership of 45 nations. Today, it has way over 100 members. This transformation was triggered in South Asia, where political processes had evolved into a mature system of government and administration, and concepts of justice, accountability, law, and order had taken roots. Unfortunately, the benefits of egalitarianism have not been either consistently or universally applied within the region, and there are areas with glaring disparities of inequalities in income, resources, coupled with population pressures, create dangerous and explosive political situations both within the South Asian regions and its immediate neighborhood. Though culturally, socially, racially, physically, religiously, we in America are all a diverse group and may call us Pakistani, Indian, or Italian Americans, or Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Christian Americans, the bottom line that keeps us together is the fact that at the end of the day, we are all proud Americans. South Asians are an important part of my great country and produce dynamic political leaders, economists, physicians, and many more that are involved in all walks of life, creating the amalgamation of the diversity that we are all so proud of in America. Part of the economic progress that one sees in my community is based on a stable political environment where there's an accountable, transparent local government, not completely, but working to be free of corruption, inefficiencies, and wastefulness, and that provides for safe and secure investment. As one considers the challenges and opportunities that exist within South Asian region, it may be useful to examine them under the following headings. Number 1, the population expansion, which overtakes economic growth and creates pressures on all other sectors of development, and is also one of the primary elements in the political instability that is a consistent feature of the environment of this region. Religious and historical attachments, these can be highly emotional and equally inflammable. Environmental degradation. Studies have shown that environmental degradation currently being inflicted on the Indo-Ganges system are the worst in its history and perhaps the most alarming self-infested devastation devised by man. Coupled with this is the poor status of infrastructure and lack of provision of some of the basic needs of daily life, that is clean water and low-cost energy. Illiteracy. Aristotle has said there is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance. In this era, when learning tools are readily available, the thirst of knowledge so vast and enthusiastic, the prevalence of illiteracy as it now exists in South Asian regions is little short of a crime against humanity. Lack of regional cooperation due to low levels of market integration, border barriers, and divisions amongst countries has impeded the growth of this region. This region under discussion is amongst the richest and most productive in world history and has brought forth men, ideas, and methods that have enriched the entire world. Coming on to regionalism. Regionalism promotes peace and stability by stimulating innovation and productivity, reducing poverty, and complementing and supporting global economic institutions. Regionalism is far more important in South Asia than some other parts of the world, not only to maintain the South Asian global integration to sustain its development and growth, but also for all the rest of us around the globe. For here there are two neighboring nuclear-powered nations, and any political instability on either side can set a catastrophic cascade of events which will not have regional but global effects. So in fact, South Asian regionalism is not just important for you here, but for all of us living in America and all of us around the globe, for this part of the world to be looked at for future business investments and economic development. South Asia must learn from Western Europe. If countries that had the worst wars in human history can now not only coexist in durable peace, but can become economically integrated, then why not here? It's not the political leadership, but the business leadership that brings regionalism, political development, democratization, and peace. Different factors that served as a catalyst for me and my motivation to get involved in my city's politics, that is economic development of the community, job creation, and as a desire to bring back to the community the fundamentals of government, that is to provide health, safety, and quality of life to its residents, were the goals that brought a fragmented community together. The challenges that have been indicated above are of an ongoing nature and by no means beyond solutions. As a representative of my city and citizens, I was elected to lead and not follow the mistakes of the past. It's an ideal opportunity for an orchestrated approach by like-minded people for serious consideration for future of South Asian society. This meeting today opens new avenues of mutual cooperation for the betterment of our societies and development and growth of our diasporic needs. Ladies and gentlemen, if a person like me, raised in a third world country ridden with bureaucracy and corruption, can bring reforms to a city in one of the most advanced Western societies, working together, you can change the impression of this region from that of third world to a progressive region which will lead the world into the 22nd century. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am not going to even try to summarize this very rich discussion, so I will just invite questions from the audience. Somebody there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Eric Manis from the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I'd like to speak to the points made about regional integration and the issues the steps that need to be taken. We've done some research on restrictiveness, and we find that on a trade restrictiveness level, South Asia countries are the most restrictive in the world. The reason is not because of duties. Certainly the tariffs are very low. The reason that South Asia is the most restrictive region in the world is because of its non-tariff barriers. We heard some rules today about products having to touch the ground of India before they can be imported and the like, so they couldn't come in tankers. These are the kinds of rules that really have no political source. They're administrative blocks. The SAFTA, the free trade agreement for SAR, does not speak about non-tariff barriers, neither do the free trade agreements between the bilateral agreements. So I would just raise this point as the main reason why we lack regionalism at 5% of trade when Europe is at 50% is because of barriers that exist unilaterally. So maybe the first step is unilateralism before regionalism.
Thank you. Maybe at the end I'll give you a review. At the end I'll give you a review for a few minutes.
Take some questions.
I'll take a few questions.
Yeah, sure.
I'm Surya from the Institute of South Asian Studies. There has been a real or imaginary perception among India's neighbors about India's hegemonic impulses, exemplified by 1971 and then India's intervention in Sri Lanka in the 1980s and the Maldives, and the 71, of course, related to Pakistan and the creation of creation of Bangladesh from out of East Pakistan. Is this impression still a factor in South Asian regionalism, either in political terms or perhaps in economic terms? And is that the reason why some of India's neighbors are seen to invite China into the region? What are your thoughts on these subjects? Thank you.
I'll take one more question and then let the panel answer them. There was one more question over there. Anybody has another question? No. Oh, well, then, okay. Would Professor Muni or Mr. Smadja like to answer the first, to speak to the first comment? from the World Bank, gentleman from the World Bank?
Well, I am not quite competent to go into the non-tariff barriers, but a lot of the non-tariff barriers of India have already been lowered. And even in relation to Pakistan, there is a tremendous change from what the situation existed about 10 years earlier. Regarding Indian hegemonism, it's a big problem, and I think problem comes essentially from identity. I recall what Raja had said in the first session, that the homogeneous entity, which was Indian subcontinent, was actually by political barriers converted into South Asia. And this question of identity now links up with the word integration is not popular. I mean, it is popular with World Bank and other institutions, but it is not popular in the South Asian lingo. It is a cooperation which is being talked about, because integration means submerging your identity in one way or the other. And hegemonism comes out of that, and hegemonism again is a word which is very, very peculiar. But bringing China into it is always, there is a level of discomfort looking at the size of India on the one hand and each of the neighbors on the other. But whether this level of discomfort can really be successfully cushioned by bringing a third party, I am not very sure about it. And so long as the question of China's membership in SADC is concerned, don't forget that SADC is governed by unanimity of decisions, which means every member has almost a veto. Now, I don't know how many countries in South Asia would want to give China a veto. Secondly, when it comes to China's core interests, this is not the forum to go into them. I can go into details of what China's South Asia interests are. But when these interests would come into clash with it, I don't think the Chinese would be hesitant even in shaking up the regional homogeneity or integration or cooperation or whatever you call it. And I think who knows it better than the ASEAN? Recall Cambodia last July. Therefore, there are various issues to what extent China can be accommodated in SADC as a member. But engagement with China, as I said, is inevitable, is necessary, is positive, and I think the best engaged country in South Asia to China, all said and done, is India.
Would you like to comment something?
Well, the question of Indian hegemony, let me make the point that India is a very large country, and all the neighbors put together would still be smaller than India in economic terms or in terms of wealth or income. India has borders with virtually all its neighbors, but our neighbors do not have borders with each other. So India is the main transit country. So India's size is a reality, and I do not think that India can start cutting itself into pieces in order to assure its neighbors. India will do everything possible to reassure its neighbors, but there are limits to what it can do to earn confidence. That is why I said that given the reality of those political divisions, it has been important for India to try and see whether it can use its own size as an asset. It is inevitable that when you are a large country surrounded by small neighbors, there will be, whether you like it or not, apprehensions about India's dominating status. So India has to be conscious of that, and I think India is conscious of that. Is less, I think, prickly today in terms of its relationship with its neighbors than it was in the past. And is it possible for India to use its economic size and dynamism to be, as I said, a factor for promoting prosperity, promoting economic welfare of our neighbors? My sense is that if we are able to do this, some of the sharpness of the divisions, political divisions, can perhaps diminish. And I think we should be a little careful in talking about, as if regionalism has been almost a complete failure in South Asia. That's not true. If you look at sub-regional cooperation in India, actually it has done rather well. If you see the free trade agreement between India and Sri Lanka, if you see the open borders that we have with Nepal, look at the kind of economic interdependency which has been built up with Bhutan. If you take that in totality, actually these are very good examples of what can be achieved through cross-border economic linkages, benefiting not just India, but benefiting the smaller neighbors as well. I'll give you just one example. Today, there are 140 flights a week between Sri Lanka and India. And most of it is not an Indian airline, it is all Sri Lankan airline. So there are huge benefits that neighbors can get from closer economic relationship. That is why I think Professor Muni repeated something that I had said long ago, that neighbors also need to look at India as an opportunity, not as a threat. So this is not something that can be done only by one side. There has to be also a resonance from the other side. And lastly, about non-tariff barriers. Of course, there are non-tariff barriers. But I mean, I can make the same complaint about non-tariff barriers that we face in terms of our entry into many of the developed markets. I think what is important is that this has been recognized. Even with respect to India and Pakistan, we have a group which is trying to lower these non-tariff barriers. There is the kind of trade regime that we have established today with, say, Bangladesh. As far as the LDCs in the region are concerned, India has offered and is practicing completely duty-free access. But yes, there are some non-tariff barriers which are being addressed, like for example, phytosanitary standards. But these are issues that need to be resolved, and I think India is willing to resolve these. Much more important is perhaps what is going to be addressed in the next session, which is connectivity. Because unless you have the nuts and bolts of free movement of goods, people's ideas, you will not get the kind of integration. You can have a free trade agreement, but if you do not have the channels through which goods can move, that free trade agreement is of not much use. So having a focus on physical connectivity, making sure that the software of regional trade and investment is also put in place, that is the way forward. And I think that is precisely the direction in which we are moving.
Thank you. Claude?
I would like to agree with our colleague here from the World Bank. I think when you look at this group of countries, it is true that these countries have been or have had a tradition of being restrictive or having, I was about to say, almost a suspicious approach to international trade. And I think at this stage, Minister Shyam Saran has mentioned what is now being done between Pakistan and India in terms of looking at the non-tariff barriers. I think the most urgent issue now, or the most urgent task, is really to try to establish a catalogue of all the impediments, all the very practical measures, elements which are slowing down, restricting trade. I think trade facilitation should be today the #1 priorities. I think the #2 priorities, and I fully agree with Minister Saran, what will be discussed next about connectivity is also an absolutely crucial task. But there is also, as I mentioned before, a culture of suspicion. There is a culture of looking at trade in a way which is not fully open. There is this notion, whether it is because of political consideration or because of the size of India, etc., that all these aspects are looked at, or is he or is this country going to win more than I will be going to win? And I think it is this kind of mindset that needs to change. I think this part of the world needs to learn what I would call the win-win approach. There is no win-win approach in this part of the world, and I think it is a crucial priority that this part of the world knows that today's relationship have to be based and can be based on win-win.
Thank you. Dr. Hashmi?
I can't speak of what the neighbors feel because I'm not one of the neighbors. But looking from an outside perspective as an average American, what we see is an intense lack of trust between neighbors, and that is based on previous history. And I think it is about time that people get over their previous history and look forward to a future vision for all of South Asian regions.
Thank you. Any other questions? We still have 10 minutes. Oh, no, sorry, I didn't see.
Hello, Leader Pinsler here. I want to allude to something that Mr. Smadja raised earlier, and I wanted to find out what the views of the other panel members was. He talked about the absolute imperative, the do or die necessity of regionalization. Is that something the other panel members agree with? Is there, on the contrary, a feeling that we've muddled along so far, we've made little steps, there has been progress, and that's all that's necessary? Because surely if he is right, and it is an imperative, then actually everything else falls into place and people will find a means of getting together.
Thank you. Would you like to start?
Well, I think I made the point, at least from the Indian perspective, that if India thought of any kind of a credible role for itself in the region, either as an economic power or as a political power, or even a global role, if it did not do it on the foundation of regional cooperation, regional integration, this effort would not succeed. So that is fairly well understood in India. How to actually translate this into the nuts and bolts of regional cooperation is really a practical issue that we have to deal with, and that is not something that India can do alone. India can do something by itself by, say, unilaterally opening up its market, say, to the LDCs. But it cannot do everything unilaterally. There are limits to unilateralism. Second is, I think we are not broadening the agenda enough as far as South Asia is concerned. If you ask me, as someone who has dealt with climate change, you know, there are issues relating to climate change, whether it is in terms of change in weather patterns, in terms of the kind of crisis that agriculture is facing in our region because of climate change. What may happen to the entire subcontinent if there is melting of glaciers, for example, taking place in the Himalayas? All our river systems are dependent on that. It's not only India, but all the other countries. These are overweening issues, which actually, if you are looking at these challenges, many of the other challenges we are talking about really fade into insignificance. So there is also a need to try and broaden the agenda, to look at what are the ways in which some of these cross-cutting challenges that we are facing, how do we get together and deal with them? Because even the largest country in the region cannot deal with them by itself. So this is another aspect in terms of, you know, what we can do in conferences like this. I think we also need to be able to get the agenda broadened. It's not only, of course, a question of South Asian countries. I mean, some of these issues are also international in nature. I mean, climate change is a global phenomenon. But certainly the impact on a region like South Asia is probably going to be much worse than other regions of the world. So are there ways in which we can really work together, not only within the region, but also make our voice heard in the international fora? That is also something that you need to do. So there are ways in which we can actually promote that kind of a regionalization, a regional sense, if we are able to actually broaden the agenda.
Raja, you had a question.
Sir, and others to reflect on one aspect. I mean, I think if you leave the negotiations entirely to the national capitals, we've talked about distrust and a range of problems that exist. how about bringing the real stakeholders in trade across borders, which are actually the bordering regions? Is there a way we can think of promoting more, say, Punjab cooperation, or bring more cooperation between Bangladesh and the Northeast, between Nepal, Tibet, and Northern Indian Plains? Is there a way you can imagine where the national capitals will actually let go and allow the regions to negotiate and to create conditions where the regionalism can actually, as a whole, progress?
Can I intervene on 2 points?
Sure. 3 even.
Okay. First of all, I think your point is absolutely crucial because, in fact, the best way to address these kind of issues, in my view, is really to go from a very practical, down-to-earth perspective. What you are talking about is really creating clusters of growth. And I think this would be a very practical approach. And you come from the United States, you come from Texas. If I look, for instance, at the example of Mexico and the United States, and you see the way, despite sometimes the difficulties at the national level, the way collaboration between states from the United States and states from Mexico, this collaboration is working. It is absolutely interesting. I think Singapore has invented the notion of clusters of growth. And I think this is something that the region should put to use in a very pragmatic, intensive way. This is the first remark I would like to make. I would like to come back to another point, which is very important. I do believe that the global trade landscape is changing, has changed radically. This is today a landscape of regional and inter-regional arrangements and agreements. And I think it begs the question, where does it leave South Asia 7, 10 years down the road? And I think if this part of the world doesn't put its act together, it will be left on the sidelines. Inexorably. And I think people don't realize the urgency to jump into this train of a transformation, the radical transformation of the global trade scene. Point number 3, and I would like to join what Minister Saran has just mentioned, there are some global issues, climate change being one of them. But it is not the only one. But what we see today is, in fact, that we are moving toward a multifaceted globalization. In the 90s, people felt that globalization would just be synonymous with Americanization. We know today that this is wrong. We know today that globalization is assuming different faces. There is a China face of globalization. There is a continental European face of globalization. There is an American face of globalization. There is even, if I listen to Mr. Putin, there would be or there should be a Russian face of globalization. Let me leave aside my own opinion about that. But again, where does that leave India and the countries around India if they are not part of the game? What would it mean for this part of the world as the world evolves along these trends? I think these are questions today where, in a way, it is really about time that they are addressed with this sense of urgency. And maybe the trigger for urgency are issues like climate change, because these are becoming life and death issues.
Thank you. The gentleman there was waiting patiently for a question.
Thank you. My name is Ravi Mantha. I have a follow-up question to Mr. Saran's earlier comment. You're talking about climate change as a common thread. I think there is another larger one, which is one of social justice, which is manifesting in the region as a, I mean, in different ways. For example, the Maoism in India, it's a serious internal security issues. The Talibanization in Pakistan, Maoism, of course, in Nepal, and obviously Sri Lanka had its own issues. So would you comment about this common thread? I mean, I think that fundamentally there is a social justice element which is also tied up with changing climate and all these other things. But it all has slightly different flavor across the region, but fundamentally the issues are the same. They just have different brands based on whether they're religious or not.
Sure.
Well, you know, I would say that many of the aspects that you have mentioned in a sense are consequences which perhaps manifest themselves in different ways to the lack of economic and social development. It is because of the fact that we have fallen behind in terms of, unless your cake is big, you can't really distribute it, you know, in a somewhat egalitarian manner. I think we have got out of that. You know, this debate whether we should be increasing the cake or whether we should be dividing whatever we have equally. I think it is fairly well accepted now that you have to grow the cake before you can think in terms of. So it is economic and social development that is the key to dealing with many of the social issues that you are talking about, because at the end of the day, these are born out of very real grievances. People who see others are going ahead, they are being left behind. So how do you bring about more inclusive growth? One of the things is that by greater economic cooperation amongst the countries of the region, through greater regional integration, you have greater opportunities for growth, you have greater opportunities for economic and social development for all the countries in the region. If we are able to do that, many of the problems that you are referring to, in fact, will get diminished.
Okay, we almost run out of time, but I think I should give the three, Professor Muni and Dr. Hashmi, 1 minute each to comment on not just the last question, but anything that strikes you. 1 minute.
I'd like to address the lady's question, what I felt about Mr. Claude's comment, and I do feel it's very important. I think that almost 1/5 of the world's population lives in South Asia, and anything that promotes peace and harmony in this volatile region will be a beneficial thing. And if that takes regionalism, I think then it's all good.
Well, again, two questions. One is the first one, whether we feel necessity. I feel it is necessary, but I'm not quite convinced if all these states in South Asia feel that this is necessary. Because Pakistan has looked towards east, going into eco. India encouraged BIMSTEC to take this away, and Nepal may be thinking in many other terms. Therefore, until these states are convinced that this is necessity, you will not see the change written on the decisions. The second is about Raja's question of stakeholders. In democracies, stakeholders are taken into account in one form or the other. I can give you several examples in which the bilateral relations stakeholders have come. Tea growers in Nilgiri were a major stakeholder in free trade agreement between India and Sri Lanka. So stakeholders are taken into account, and still they can be encouraged, but they will have to be negotiated through the state channels, you like it or not, because there is no way that you can give a free decision to the stakeholders to find out the agreements and run their businesses in a manner they want to.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the session. I'd like to ask you to join me thanking all the panel.